Picture this, a stone chamber before dawn, the air so thick with burning copal incense it claws at your throat, drums pound slow and heavy, each strike echoing like a heartbeat. Beneath, the earth candles sputter against walls, painted with blood shadows, stretching long and alive across the stone. A young woman kneels. Her hair tangled, her breathing ragged, her mouth opening in a silent scream that vanishes under the rising chant of priests. The smell of sweat, blood, and smoke twists together until you cannot tell where the body ends and the ritual begins. You are standing there, trapped inside their world, no escape, only the sound of voices calling to gods who demanded flesh and desire. The city of Tenochtitlan rose like a dream from the waters of Lake Texcoco, a city of stone causeways, glittering canals and markets overflowing with color, sound, and life. From a distance it was beauty, perfection, order, but within its heart pulsed something darker. Here, every breath, every grain of maize, every drop of rain was believed to be purchased with blood. Religion was not a gentle guide, it was a chain, it was the law, it was the empire's beating heart. The gods of the Aztecs were not forgiving deities of mercy. They were forces of hunger, insatiable and merciless, demanding flesh as offering and desire as tribute. The high priests, draped in obsidian and jaguar skins, moved like shadows. Across the temples, their eyes cold, their voices heavy with chants that carried over the city like smoke. Children grew up beneath those chants, women woke and slept beneath them. Men went to war with them, burning in their ears. It was not devotion. It was obedience carved into the skin of the people from birth. Imagine walking through the great plaza. Thousands gathered, their heads lowered, as the drums began to pound. The smell of incense clung to the air, but beneath it was the sharper stench of blood never fully washed from the temple stones. Above all towered the Templo Mayor, its twin shrines dedicated to gods who demanded not prayers but bodies. Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, who needed blood to rise each morning. Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility, who needed tears and flesh to keep the crops alive. The people were told their world would collapse without sacrifice, that their very survival depended on submission to ritual. And so obedience was not just spiritual, it was survival. But sacrifice was not only about blood, it was also about control of the body, about bending desire itself into a tool of power. Women chosen for rituals were told they were blessed, but their blessing was fear and silence. Men chosen were told they were warriors, but their glory ended, bound, painted, and stripped of dignity. Sexuality was twisted into obedience, a currency with which priests paid the gods. This was not passion, it was politics, not intimacy, but control. Every ritual carried a double-edged beauty for the gods, horror for the living. And in this world, where power masked cruelty as devotion, what followed would shatter lives and leave echoes that even time could not bury. It began with the choosing. Priests moved through the city like hunters, their eyes scanning the faces of girls, barely grown, their silence more terrifying than words. A touch of the hand, a mark drawn across the skin, a whisper of the god's decision, and a life was no longer her own. These chosen were not told. No, they were told, blessed, blessed to become brides of the divine vessels of fertility, gifts to the gods themselves. But beneath the blessing lay a sentence. The young women were taken into chambers where the light was dim and the air thick with incense that never faded. Their hair was combed until it shone, their bodies painted in ash and cinnabar, a mingling of purity and death. They were taught to walk slowly, to lower their eyes, to smile when commanded, though the smile trembled like a leaf in the wind. Imagine being one of them, the drums beating in your chest, the knowledge that each step forward carried you closer. Not to honor, but to silence. Purity was redefined. Not as freedom, but as surrender. Sexuality itself was claimed by the gods, yet controlled by the priests. On ritual nights, a chosen girl was led to the altar, not only as a sacrifice, but first as a consort. The priests declared it holy union, though it was neither holy nor union. It was possession clothed in sacred words, obedience reshaped into ritual intimacy. The girl's trembling body became an offering. Her silence became the hymn. And when it ended, her destiny was not life, but the obsidian knife waiting at dawn. The people watched, believing this was devotion, that the gods demanded such offerings to keep the sun alive and the rains steady. But in truth, it was control masked as worship. Fear disguised as faith. Every sigh, every cry, every breath taken in that chamber was absorbed by the stone walls that already carried centuries of echoes. For men too, desire was redefined. Captives taken in war were stripped, their bodies painted with bright colors, their hair cut and reshaped into parody of bridal adornment. They were mocked, made symbols of union before being led to sacrifice. It was humiliation, ritualized destruction of dignity that told the city obedience was stronger than pride. Psychology wrapped itself tightly around each victim. Those who watched learned the lesson as clearly as those who bled. If the gods demanded flesh, then flesh was no longer your own. If the gods demanded desire, then even desire was property. To be claimed, not yours; to give, not yours; to withhold. This was the cruel brilliance of the system. To bend not only the body but the soul, to take the most intimate human acts and twist them into weapons of obedience. The festivals grew louder each year. Torches burned higher, drums pounded deeper, chants rose like waves across the city. But within that noise lay silences unspoken, silences of girls who never returned, silences of men stripped of pride, silences of families who dared not weep too loudly. The empire thrived on those silences, and the gods carved into stone smiled not with mercy, but with hunger. What followed would not only deepen these rituals, but turn them into nights of endless torment, where entire plazas shook with screams dressed as prayers. Take a breath. If you want more stories where history whispers its darkest secrets, subscribe. Stay with us as we walk deeper into the shadows of the past, because what lies ahead will test the silence within you. The rituals of fertility were framed as celebrations of life, but within them hid the deepest shadows of control. Each year as planting season approached, the priests announced that the gods demanded brides, not brides of men, brides of the divine. Young women were chosen from families across the empire. Their beauty praised, their purity declared a gift. Parents wept in silence, torn between pride and dread, knowing that a blessing in the eyes of the temple was a sentence in truth. The chosen were led to chambers draped in woven cloths, smelling of copal and crushed flowers. But beneath the sweetness was the metallic tang of dried blood, soaked deep into the stone. Their hair was braided, their bodies painted with white ash, a symbol of purity mixed with streaks of red cinnabar, the color of sacrifice. They were told to smile, told to bow, told to carry themselves like queens, even as their hands trembled. The ceremony began. With songs, the air thick with the sound of flutes and drums, the rhythm meant to mimic the pulse of the earth. In the plaza, the people gathered, whispering prayers, believing that each bride would ensure fertile crops, abundant rains, survival itself. But within the temple walls, the ritual was far from celebration. The priest would declare the union holy. He would place his hands upon the girl as if she were a vessel of the gods themselves. Her cries, if they came, were drowned beneath chants that rose higher and louder until they pressed against the ceiling like smoke with no escape. The act was called sacred marriage. In truth, it was ritualized violation, a body transformed into a field to be sown, not with love, but with power. And when the act ended, the girl was no longer considered human, but divine, her body marked for the blade. The next morning, she was dressed again in flowers, her skin painted in shimmering colors, as if she were a goddess walking among mortals. She was led up the steps of The Templo Mea, her eyes hollow, her lips silent, her body already drained of freedom. There before thousands she was offered to the gods, her chest opened, her heart lifted, her silence consumed by the roar of the crowd. The people saw fertility in that sacrificed life for the fields, rain for the crops, but the truth was cruelty sanctified. The psychological scars did not end with the victims alone. Families learned to quiet their grief, to bury screams in their throats, to praise what they feared. Because to question was to defy the gods themselves. Obedience was taught not through sermons, but through the trembling of daughters and the silence of mothers. Each generation inherited the lesson that their bodies, their desires, their lives were not their own. Sexuality became property of the temple. Intimacy became tribute. The women who survived long enough to see others chosen carried their memories like stones, heavy and unspoken. Imagine walking through the marketplace and seeing a mother's eyes dark with grief as she pretended to smile, her daughter gone. Her silence demanded. The empire's strength was built not only on conquest and blood, but on these unspoken tragedies folded into ritual disguised as holiness, and so the cycle repeated. Season after season, year after year, obedience, fertilizing the soil as much as rain or sun. For the Aztec Empire, fertility was not a gift of nature. It was purchased through the sacrifice of the body, through the silencing of desire, through the reshaping of purity into fear. What followed would only deepen that cruelty, as men too would learn that their bodies were no longer their own, stripped and humiliated in rituals of domination that blurred the line between worship and control. The cruelty of the rituals did not rest only on women. Men too were bound within the same system of fear, obedience and silence. War captives were paraded through the streets, their heads held high at first, pride still burning in their eyes, but the fire dimmed with each step closer to the temple. They were painted in bright colors, their skins smeared with chalk and ochre, symbols of fertility scrawled across their chests. They were mocked as brides of the gods, adorned with garlands, their hair cut and reshaped their bodies, dressed in fragments of women's garments. Masculinity was stripped from them piece by piece until they were no longer seen as warriors, but as objects. The people were told it was holy union with the divine, but it was humiliation made sacred, a ritual of emasculation designed to remind all who watched that no man, no matter how strong, could defy the gods or the priests who spoke in their name inside the temple. Chambers, the air pressed heavy with sweat and incense. The captives were forced to kneel, their bodies painted with ash, their mouths silenced by chants. They were told they were honored, yet their dignity was shattered beneath ritual touch, beneath forced intimacy presented as sacred. Desire was never theirs to own. It was stolen, reshaped, and used as a weapon against them. The act was not devotion, it was domination, not faith, but politics. The priests understood that breaking a man before tearing out his heart made the lesson clearer to the crowd. It was not enough to take life. They had to take pride. They had to fracture the self until nothing remained but obedience. And when the ritual ended, the captive was dragged to the altar, still marked by humiliation, still wearing the trappings of parody. The garlands now wilted, the paint streaked with sweat. The blade fell, his body discarded, but his silence remained. For those watching, the message was unmistakable. Masculinity was not protection. Strength was not shield. Pride was nothing before the gods. The cycle of obedience was complete. In this theater of cruelty, sexuality was not passion but performance, orchestrated by power, choreographed to remind the living of their submission. Every humiliation, every scream, every silence was etched into the memory of the city, into the minds of those who dared even to imagine resistance. The people learned that desire itself was dangerous, that intimacy could be weaponized against them, that, even in the deepest corners of the body, the gods could reach through the hands of priests. This was not worship, this was control carved into flesh, and it prepared the empire for nights of endless ritual where entire plazas burned with torches and echoed with screams disguised as prayers. Night fell over Tenochtitlan, but it was no ordinary night. The plaza glowed with thousands of torches, their flames bending in the wind like restless spirits, the air trembling with heat and smoke. The drums began first slow like a heartbeat, then faster, deeper, until the ground itself seemed to pulse with sound. Flutes shrieked high above the rhythm, voices rose in chants, waves of syllables crashing against the temple walls. The smell of copal incense filled every breath, sweet at first, then suffocating, mixed with sweat, with fear, with the faint metallic sting of blood already spilled. Crowds pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit by firelight, half shadow. Half-flame eyes wide with awe and terror, they whispered prayers, their voices lost beneath the pounding of drums. Their silence woven into the ritual. At the steps of the Templo Mayor, victims stood in rows, their bodies painted, their skin glistening. With oil and sweat, some were trembling, some stood still, their faces blank as if their souls had already fled. Women adorned with flowers in their hair, their lips painted crimson, their eyes lowered as if in shame or surrender. Men painted in bright colors mocked as brides of gods, their pride stripped, their dignity burned away beneath the gaze of thousands. Each victim was led forward one by one, the priests cloaked in jaguar skins, their obsidian blades gleaming black under torchlight moved. With deliberate rhythm, like actors in a play rehearsed for centuries, a girl stepped forward, her feet bare against the stone, her body trembling, her breath shallow. She was led into the chamber where chants swelled louder, drowning her silence. Her body used as vessel, her purity claimed as ritual. When she emerged again, it was not to live, but to climb the steep steps of the temple where the blade awaited. Her cries, if they came, were swallowed by the roar of the drums, by the chants of the priests, by the gasps of the crowd. Then the blade fell, her heart lifted to the night sky, her blood rushing down the steps, mixing with flowers scattered beneath her feet. The crowd erupted not in horror, but in reverence. They had been taught this was survival, that without these offerings the sun would not rise, the rains would not fall, the earth itself would starve. And so they watched and believed, even as their bodies shivered, even as their stomachs turned, even as their dreams later filled with screams they dared not name. The rituals continued deep into the night. Man after man, woman after woman led forward, their bodies claimed their dignity, stripped, their blood spilled upon the stone. The plaza became a sea of sound, drums, flutes, voices, screams, chants all blending into one relentless tide. The air grew heavy with smoke and heat until it clung to the skin like oil, every breath a struggle, every sound echoing in the chest. Children clutched at their mothers' eyes, wide mouths, silent, learning early that obedience meant survival, silence meant life. Imagine standing there, the torchlight flickering against your skin, the smell of smoke and blood pressing into your lungs, the sound of drums rattling your bones. You know that to look away is dangerous, to cry too loudly is dangerous, to question even in your heart is dangerous. So you stand still, you watch, you whisper the prayers you were taught, and you bury the horror deep within your chest where no one can see. The city itself became complicit, each voice added to the chant, each silence another offering. The priests raised their blood-stained hands to the sky, declaring the gods satisfied, but the hunger never ended. The torches burned lower, the chants slowed, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. For within that silence lingered the truth. This was not devotion, it was domination, not worship, but obedience carved into flesh and memory. The victims were gone, their blood soaked into the stone, their bodies discarded, but their silence remained. And the city stood in that silence, complicit witnesses to cruelty, disguised as faith to desire, twisted into obedience to power, masked as survival. The night ended, but its echoes never faded, because once you had stood in that plaza, once you had heard those drums, smelled that blood, felt the weight of silence pressing on your chest, you could never forget. The walls remembered even if you tried to forget, and the gods carved into stone smiled their eternal smile, hungry still. When the torches burned out and the drums finally stilled, the city returned to its rhythm of markets and canals as if nothing had happened. But for those who survived, the silence was heavier. Then the noise mothers, who had watched their daughters taken away, kept their grief locked behind closed doors, their faces still, their voices soft, their tears shed only in the quiet hours before dawn. Fathers who had seen their sons humiliated before. The gods swallowed their rage, turned it into obedience, because to question was to risk another offering, another loss. Children who had stood in the crowd carried the echoes of screams into their dreams, growing up with the lesson that silence was safer than truth. The empire thrived on these silences. Historical texts carved in stone glorified the gods, celebrated the victories, praised the rituals as sacred acts of survival. Nowhere were the cries of women recorded, nowhere the trembling of captives. Nowhere the quiet horror that pressed against the walls of every home. The official story was one of glory and devotion, but the true story was written in scars that no stone could capture. Generations inherited that weight, obedience becoming instinct. Fear passed down like blood itself. To live was to obey, to desire was to surrender, to survive was to remain silent. And yet even within the silence, resilience lingered. A mother's whispered lullaby carrying love despite fear, a father's hand resting firm on a child's shoulder, a small act of kindness in the marketplace, a glance of empathy between those who had lost. These fragments of humanity endured hidden beneath the shadow of cruelty, but the empire's strength rested on forgetting on, teaching each generation to bow their heads, to accept ritual as life. And so the trauma did not vanish, it transformed. It became the structure of obedience, the rhythm of submission, the silence of survival. Centuries later, the stones of the temples still carry the weight of those silences. The walls remember the footsteps of the chosen, the cries muffled by chants, the hearts lifted in the night air. The empire has fallen, its gods reduced to statues, its rituals to memory, but the echoes remain because cruelty disguised as devotion leaves scars deeper than history can erase, scars that stretch across time, that whisper still in the quiet corners of memory, and those who survived carried them not only in their bodies, but in the very air they left behind. The story of ancient devotion does not end with the ashes of the temple or the silence of the ritual. It lingers, woven into the very language of power, obedience, and faith. What was once called sacred was for many simply cruelty, wearing a mask of holiness. History carved the names of kings, priests, and gods into stone. Their victories endured, their rituals immortalized. But what of the nameless, the women bound to gods they did not choose, the men stripped of dignity before the altar, the children who grew up hearing whispers through walls, carrying nightmares they could never name? Their pain was never recorded, their voices were erased, and yet silence is never truly empty. It echoes, it shapes, it teaches. The survivors who walked away did not carry freedom, they carried scars, scars that bent them into obedience, that taught them to kneel before power, that told them suffering was divine. This inheritance of fear became the true legacy of those nights. Civilization moved forward, kingdoms fell, empires rose, new religions replaced the old. Yet the pattern remained. Cruelty repainted as devotion, pain rebranded as sacrifice, obedience dressed as faith. The stage changed, but the shadows remained the same. And so we are left with a haunting question. When we look at our own rituals, our own displays of power, are we witnessing progress or echoes? How much of what we call tradition is simply another mask, hiding the same old cruelty? In the end, the stones of those ancient temples may have crumbled, the torches may have gone dark, but the memory, unwritten, unspoken, yet alive, still lingers in the silence between words, in the unease that creeps into our bones when we hear of devotion taken to its extreme. Because the truth is this: power remembers its victories. Victims remember their pain, and walls remember everything. The walls remember even when history forgets.